Right, so we'll be talking about more metaphysics here. So, one thing I want to start with, and sort of framing this, is to distinguish between what Kant called noumena and phenomena. Phenomena we can just consider as our ordinary sensory environment, of tables, chairs, rocks, mountains. Right, that's what phenomena is. Noumena, on the other hand, is what underlies phenomenon, right? It's the cause of the phenomena, and noumena are sort of regarded as imperceptible. Although I do sort of want to mention that I am using noumena loosely here, right? I'm not necessarily advocating that noumena is unknowable or anything like that, as Kant said. I'm just kind of using it to distinguish it um between phenomena. And what I want to impress upon you is that metaphysics deals with noumena, not phenomena. Right? Metaphysics is trying to deal with the thing that underlies the phenomena and causes it, rather than the phenomena itself. Although, if you're like a radical empiricist or something like that, you might be suspicious about, imperceptible noumena or anything like that. That's sort of beyond the scope of the video. But that point is well taken. Another distinction that I want to make was made by Stoljar, and I'll link here. There's an article in the SCP about physicalism. And another distinction that I want to make here is between two uses of the word physical, right? And Stoljar, so he very helpfully sort of distinguishes between object-physicalism and theory-physicalism. Object-physicalism refers to sort of what we more colloquially mean by the word physical, right? Objects like tables and chairs, and things of that nature. Whereas theory-physicalism refers to physics, right? And what physics can tell us about the universe. And we need to be careful not to conflate or confuse those two things, right? In using the word physical, with object physicalism and theory physicalism, at different points, right? And the important thing to note is that these two concepts of physical, as Stoljar says, are not coextensive, which is just fancy way of saying that they don't refer to the same things. They're sort of mutually incompatible. You can't use physical in both senses and still be coherent, right? And so, I want to sort of get deeper into the weeds here. Right? So what is physical? What does it mean for something to be physical? Right? And, Hempel's dilemma is a well-known sort of challenge to theory-physicalism. Right? Because when people use the word physical, at least in a metaphysical context, they're typically referencing physics, right? The entities and postulates that physics deals with. And so you would want to define physicalism in reference to physics. Hempel's dilemma tries to problematize that, right? And it basically says, which physics are you talking about? Defining physicalism as referencing current physics? And if so, then it's trivially false, because we know that current physics isn't complete. And if you're referring to some ideal complete physics in the future, then it sort of becomes empty, right? We don't know what physics will be like in the future, and so we can't, like, to use it to define physical is to not say much at all. And so this is sort of the challenge that Hempel's dilemma poses to people who want to define physicalism in reference to physics, right? You sort of have to overcome this dilemma if you want to sort of get cogent over there. And so I'm referencing Jessica Wilson here, and I'll sort of link a paper that she has about this, right? She sort of goes through this stepwise phase, right? She goes, you try to define physicalism via current physics, via ideal physics, and she accepts, at least if I'm understanding correctly, that accepts Hempel's dilemma. And so if you accept it, then we're left with this mystery of how are we defining physical, right? And so she introduces or explicates the no fundamental mentality thesis, which basically says that what it means for something to be physical is that it is not fundamentally mental. And in that sense, now you have a coherent and positive account of what it means for something to be physical. And so that's sort of how she gets around it. But what I want to impress upon you is that there's no fundamentality thesis. It's not an empirical finding, right? It's a metaphysical abstraction. It's a theoretical inference. And so what I would want to argue is that the hard problem isn't an empirical problem, it's conceptual. Philip Goff sort of made a similar argument. There's this video, I'll link it again in the description, by Richard Brown, where he watches I think 4 academics, sort of Neil Seth is one of them, detail what they think. And so Richard Brown sort of took issue with framing it like this, which I found interesting, where he's like, no, like the empirical stuff is adding something constitutive to this, or it's something substantive rather, to this debate. And so we shouldn't only think about it so like that. And yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. It definitely made me wonder, but yeah, I'm still like, my current thinking is that, the hard problem isn't empirical, it's conceptual. And it's only, I get the impression, for example, that a lot of physicalists, they feel like, let's say non-physicalists, they feel like non-physicalists are sort of just working on gut intuition, right? They'll say something like, it doesn't seem like the physical, or it doesn't seem like consciousness is physical. And you could justly ask, like, well, it doesn't really matter what it seems like, right? That's not really an argument. It seems like you're just sort of going off of gut intuition. And so I'd want to sort of sharpen that and say that the hard problem is only valid in relation to the no fundamentality thesis, right? If you add the no fundamentality thesis into your notion of what it means to be physical, that's the hard problem. You've generated the hard problem. And so I'd sort of want to mention that, to show that it's not just like I'm not trying to proffer some sort of vague intuition where it seems like consciousness isn't physical and it's hard to imagine how consciousness could arise. So I'd want to sort of sharpen that and say that the hard problem is only hard in relation to the no fundamentality thesis, right? And so what happens, because we've inherited, as John Gaveke would say, a sort of Cartesian grammar, which is just to say like the thinking of Descartes has sort of thoroughly suffused our conceptual structures, so that we interpret these theoretical entities, or things like wave functions and quantum fields and different forces, right? We sort of implicitly and reflexively interpret these theoretical entities under the rubric of external world realism. So these theoretical entities are out there. They're not just like human-made stuff. Spatio-temporal naturalism, which again is just saying that these entities are in a space-time domain, and physical realism, which is just to say that these entities do not contain fundamental mentality, right? And we sort of make these inferences like in a snap, and I think that's just because it's like centuries of inertia. The founding ontology of science as it is modernly practiced is a materialistic one, and so it feels very natural to treat theoretical entities like this. But it's not necessarily having to be the case, right? Because, and this is something that Bertrand Russell pointed out, where he pointed out that physics works under solipsism, right? It's not like physics contradicts solipsism, or physics says that solipsism is false or anything like that. Like it works. It's not blown up by that. He obviously doesn't go in that route, but he makes, I think, the salient point. And if you sort of really grok this, and you can see how we could have more freedom in interpreting our theoretical entities in different ways without being necessarily tied to a particular way of framing, and so when these metaphysical inferences get treated as empirical facts, right? Like the metaphysical inference of the law of fundamentality thesis, when that gets treated as if it's an empirical fact that science just says, then any other, inferences that non-physicalists will make will get treated as wild speculation or departing from basic facts. And I sort of see that rhetoric around, and I would want to challenge that. Okay, let's look at the problem a bit more closely and more concretely. It's a bit abstract, so we're going to try and concretize it with some examples. So, we'll look at this in action by regarding neural correlates of consciousness and interventions on the brain that change someone's conscious state. Okay, so let's term the perceptible phenomenal brain as brain P, right? And there it is, you're all familiar with that. And then the noumenal brain, right, the one that's underlies the phenomena, the perceptible phenomena of the brain, we'll call that brain N. And, this is the closest you can get to sort of describing what it's like. It's the least incorrect way is just to do equations, but because Hempel's dilemma undercuts explaining the physical in terms of physics, and we need the no fundamentality thesis in order to sort of make physicalism coherent again, as I argued in the previous slide. That means that we can't positively identify what this thing looks like, right? We also have to do it via negativa, as they call it, where you define the brain as what it's not rather than what it is, so it's hard to sort of positively identify what it is. And this goes back to Strawson's article in The Hard Problem of Matter, when he's saying that we are deeply committed to thinking we know more about matter than we actually do. Right? And so this is basically what I was saying. It's impossible to picture what a brain would look like. The noumenal brain would look like under physicalism. Like, it's hard to understand what that would even mean. And it's important to keep in mind that the noumena is the causal element, not the phenomena, which is the effect. Right? It's the noumena that bears causal power, and not the phenomena, which is the effect of the noumena. And so, positing something physical, which is, say, something non-experiential or independent from experience, actually comes at quite a high epistemic cost, as Castro put it, from the standpoint of qualia foundationalism, right? So, because qualia foundationalism says that experience is our starting point, whereas if we're positing a physical brain, right, a physical noumenal brain, then it is completely independent of any experience. And so it contrasts that, and it kind of seems like we're unaware of the cost of positing something that is non-experiential or non-mental. Kind of is like a trust fund can sort of casually spending $5,000 on shoes or something. It's like it's too cavalier, and we don't necessarily recognize how much it costs. And just to reiterate, we intuitively think that the physical is the obvious thing, right? The physical is just tables and chairs around us. But remember, once again, what Stoljar said, right? You have object-physicalism and theory-physicalism. Object-physicalism is referring to like our tables and chairs, but theory-physicalism, which is what people normally mean when they say physical, right, is referencing physics. And so we must keep that distinction in mind. Okay, so let's look at an unambiguous example of an intervention on the brain causing a change in consciousness, keeping in mind the framework that we built earlier, right? So we have brain P, which is the phenomenal brain, or the perceptual brain, and then brain N, which is the noumenal brain. And on top of that, we can let mind, which is, let's say, our thoughts, emotions, and imaginings, let that be mind, I, right? And so, when someone says the brain does this and the brain does that, this is how they sort of usually imagine the story going. You have the phenomenal brain, right? The perceptible brain, and the arrow, let's just call it an intervention, right? So let's say we're in open brain surgery and the arrow is the surgeon poking a different part of the brain or stimulating a different part of the brain, right? And then that leads to that's a religious experience, right? That's an angel, let's just say. And then they do the intervention and then the patient has a religious experience, right? And so with this sort of thinking, and you go, well, therefore the brain causes consciousness and therefore physicalism is true, right? Because this is an unambiguous example of an intervention on the brain, which is brain P, right? The phenomenal brain, influencing mind I. But, with the framework we built earlier, we can sort of challenge this and see, because this whole scheme is actually quite metaphysically neutral, right? People normally think that it's vindicating physicalism, but I would argue that it can be easily accommodated by other metaphysics. Although again, Richard Brown, the video he was watching with Neil Seth and Philip Goff and everything, I'll link it again. Philip Goff made the same point, and Richard Brown sort of pushed back on that and saying that no, you can sort of experimentally differentiate between different metaphysics, at least especially with dualism. So, that is interesting, and I'm sort of still chewing on that. Right, and so, yeah, this is metaphysically neutral, right? Brain P is not physical in the theory-physicalist sense, right? Remember, theory-physicalist sense is talking about Noumena and making reference to physics, whereas object-physicalism makes reference to objects, and so that brain wouldn't be physical if we were using physical alternative object-physicalism. But typically, when people use the word physical, they're making reference to physics, right? And so then that brain isn't physical. Right. So if we want to be consistent, right, and we're using physical in the theory-physicalist sense, then we should rather render the previous example like this, right? Brain N, which is the noumenal brain, gets intervened upon by the open brain surgeon. He stimulates a particular thing, and then someone has a religious experience. That's it, right? They say that they saw God, and because like I said, physicalism is a metaphysics that deals with Noumena, and that's why we're brain N, the noumenal brain, should be how we're imagining this, right? And so because this brain lacks any experience, right? It's independent of experience. That's what it means to be objective. Then this is the real causal agent in this scenario, right? It's actually brain N causing, if we're in the physical theoretic sense, where physical makes reference to physics, right? And so when you say the brain does this and the brain does that, you should keep in mind that we're talking about brain N, and for me, once I really grokked this, then I sort of grasped the hard problem, and I realized what it is. Because before then, I thought the hard problem was kind of like a word game or something. It's like people, they want something to be true, they want the universe to be magical or whatever, and so they just invent this problem. But clearly, intervention in the brain causes differences in someone's experience, right? And so framing it like this, I think, sort of clarifies the situation and speaks to why the hard problem is hard.